Welcome to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. I'm David Miller. I'm the secretary. Today's speaker is Dr. David Rathbone. And David's topic is Visions of the Virtual, Wittgenstein versus Deleuze. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I want to begin with three problems. First one is a problem with the concept of time. Second one is a problem with the concept of artificial intelligence. And the third is a problem with what's been come to be known as the simulation hypothesis. First of all, the time problem. You're all familiar, I'm sure. I reached back into the real world, the actual non-virtual world, and I tried to do a whiteboard. You might just make that out. Everyone knows what diagrams of the Big Bang look like. We've got one here with the Big Bang here, and invariably a cone of some kind spreading out along a time axis with time 0 at the Big Bang and a series of events along the axis of the cone at specified times, such as going from a soup of quarks into solidified atoms, into the formation of stars and galaxies, all the way up to here and now. Now, I ask you to reflect for a moment and tell me, from what perspective is this diagram drawn? It only takes a moment's reflection, really, to stop and think, well, something's going on here. Our thinking, if we can name our mental processes as thinking when we're drawing and looking at this diagram, our thinking is smuggling something in. What it's smuggling in is an assumption of transcendence, a perspective outside the universe looking at the universe. In what space is this diagram located? A sort of black void of nothingness. Of course, we know that the idea is that we're inside the universe, and the universe is the whole, is all there is, in the material sense at least. And so, of course, we can't be outside of it looking in. But my problem with time goes a bit deeper here as well. Not only that we have this sort of 0 point naively ticking along in this linear fashion from event to event until now, but fundamental to Einstein's theory of relativity, from the special version onwards, is that time is a dimension. We have our three spatial dimensions, backwards and forwards in front of us, left to right either side of us, up and down, below and above us. And then the fourth dimension of time, as physicists say, Einstein geometricized time. Now, I want to try and convince you that there's something wrong fundamentally with this way of thinking about time. The word itself tells us what a dimension is. It's a manifold which has two directions, and we measure things along that manifold. If we look at the history of ideas, we see a very interesting idea arise quite suddenly about 1896 or so, when H.G. Wells writes The Time Machine and introduces the idea that it is a human possibility, not just human possibility, it's a metaphysical possibility that we can travel backwards and forwards along this time dimension. But notice that this idea only arose for the very first time just after cinema was invented. Once film is invented, H.G. Wells sees film, gets the idea of The Time Machine and writes and publishes the book, and suddenly it's common sense. Everyone knows. Probably there's no one who's actually travelled in time yet, although on YouTube you'll find people claiming to have found evidence in films that someone's got a mobile phone from 1920 and so on. But it's all premised upon the assumption, the unquestioned and unthinking assumption, that time is a dimension. That dimension is not just a good metaphor for time, but literally a description of what time is. So, point being, something is getting smuggled in with this way of thinking. Okay, I'll leave that one hang there and turn now to the second problem, the AI problem. The question, of course, is can we make an artificial intelligence? And when would we know when this artificial intelligence was conscious? Well, in order to answer this question, surely we have to ask ourselves, what is intelligence? We seem to assume we know what the word means. In fact, we assume that it's a measurable quantity, that we have a device of some kind called intelligence quotient, an IQ test, and we can actually measure this quantity and assign a simple numeric value to it. Now, maybe there's some people out there who studied Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, back in the 70s when it came out. In there, he points out quite brilliantly the problems I'll try and put in a nutshell here. Namely, well, do you know for a start what a quotient is? Of course, it's a fraction, a ratio between two numbers. And IQ tests were developed about 100 years ago to measure a child's mental development. Childhood development is premised upon a child working at their own age. Let's say a 10-year-old who can do a 10-year-old's homework has an IQ of 100, 10 over 10. But if that child can only do a 5-year-old's homework, then they have an IQ of only 50, because the 10-year-old can only do a 5-year-old's homework. If a 10-year-old can do let's say a 20-year-old's homework, that's getting a little bit stretched and bringing out the problem I'm about to point to, then they have an IQ of 200. They can do the mental tasks of someone twice their age. So we only have to stop and think, hang on, what would it mean to extrapolate that to adults? Does that mean if you're 50 and you have the mental age of a 100-year-old, that you're an incredibly smart person with a 200 IQ? Of course not. Ridiculous. It's not hard to convince people that with IQ, we're glossing over a multi-dimensional situation, and now testing is done not on just one axis, but people talk about a multi-dimensional IQ, testing various kinds of skills, creativity, analytic skills, mathematical skills, even physical skills are brought into this multi-dimensional measure. And also emotional quotient is now a thing, and that's somehow brought into this multi-dimensional situation. Now, although, yes, that's kind of moving in the right direction and acknowledging this problem concerning the application of a measure of childhood development to adults, it is still attempting to quantify a quality, not measure a quantity, but to falsify, in fact, for all sorts of nefarious purposes, the complexities of human reality. And it exemplifies a pattern that pops up in all sorts of different ways, where instead of going back to the basic concepts and wondering if we're barking up the right tree, instead we double down and try and quantify more and more and more. In the 19th century, it might have been even a bit earlier, there's big scientific debate over what heat is, and competing theories. As we know, the theory of molecular vibration won out in the end, and that's how we all understand heat. But there was a theory for a while there that heat was a kind of ethereal substance that was named phlogiston. And for a long time, various people argued that phlogiston flowed in some invisible sense in and out of objects, and that explained why they got hot and cold. Now, we might imagine someone asking, well, there's all this natural phlogiston, can we make artificial phlogiston? Now, if you're forced into answering that question, you're in a very frustrating situation, because the point is that it's a meaningless question. It's the wrong kind of question to ask. It's neither right nor wrong, but it's premised upon something that actually is a misunderstanding of what heat is. So, can we make an artificial intelligence? Well, do we understand what intelligence is before we can even ask that question? Something is getting smuggled in our way of thinking. Again, transcendence is smuggled in some sense. All right, let me leave that hang and turn now to the simulation hypothesis. Obviously, one of the richest men in the world advocates this hypothesis, and it was first thought up by someone at Oxford University about 20 years ago, published a paper. And no one seems to be calling out, as far as I'm aware, which is very limited, of course, and maybe I'm saying something that others have said, but what we really have here is a return of history repeating itself. As Hegel said, if you're ignorant of history, then it will repeat itself. And presumably these people who are talking about simulation hypothesis are ignorant of Bishop Berkeley and his idealism, but it's a return of Berkeleyan idealism, a secularized version. For Berkeley, the real world was only apparent. The appearances were not really there. It was all in the mind of God that was happening. Now, of course, in the simulation hypothesis, it's been secularized. It's not the mind of God. It's in a supercomputer in the future, or somewhere else in some broad sense that's generating and feeding in the data that we interpret as the real world. Now, Kant's refutation of idealism dealt with Berkeley and deals very simply with the simulation hypothesis as well. It's just a one-page in Kant that was only included in the B edition. Various people complained to him after the A edition. It just wasn't clear enough. And so when he published the B edition, he put in this one page to try and say, look, it's very clear. It's one of the best pages Kant ever wrote. What's wrong with Berkeley? The refutation of Berkeley's idealism runs like this. You can't get stable subjects without enduring objects. You can't have a sense of identity subjectively in time if you don't have objects objectively in space. Hesitate for a moment before you just reject that and say it's a circular piece of reasoning, and stop to think. If the assumption is that we're put into the simulation, not that we grew up in the simulation, very much like Robinson Crusoe. We say we can be on our own, having our language, having our experience, seeing everything, just like Robinson Crusoe did on the island without any communication or interaction. But Robinson Crusoe didn't grow up on the island. And if Robinson Crusoe had grown up on the island, he wouldn't be Robinson Crusoe. If somehow he'd miraculously grown up without any human interaction, animals brought him up or something, he certainly wouldn't have a name. He certainly wouldn't know the English language. He certainly wouldn't have any of the ways that we have learned to categorize and organize and understand and interpret the world. It seems to me there's, again, in the simulation hypothesis, transcendence is getting smuggled in. The thought of transcendence, but it's an unthinking concept of transcendence. So with those three problems, I want to try and focus our attention and compare how Deleuze and Wittgenstein both offer us new ways to think about transcendence in a non-superstitious way, let me say. The old story about transcendence is that we're a pre-existent soul in some sense, whether it's the Platonic version or all the various religions, many of them, if not all, have a version of this way of thinking, that we're a pre-existing entity of some sort who falls into the world and starts undergoing time and may, if we're lucky, transcend the world somehow through meditation or some salvation, some kind of way to eject us up out of our immanence and to transcend back into heaven or nirvana. If we're trying to think about transcendence in a non-superstitious way, in a way that doesn't help itself to this unclear notion, this non-phenomenological notion of a soul then perhaps it's helpful to begin by rethinking our prehistory. I want you to think for a moment of our simian ancestors at some arbitrary point, millions of years ago, before human beings evolved, but nevertheless our direct genetic predecessors. They had certain rudimentary vocal capacities, a few grunts or squawks or groans, sounds they could make with their vocal cords. And now, if purely hypothetical and non-realistic situation, if we could imagine somehow getting them together and saying, okay, how do you want to evolve? Then they would never, ever come up with the idea, oh, I would like my vocal cords to become a bit more sophisticated and articulated so that I could start to distinguish and differentiate a new manifold of sounds, and these sounds will evolve into what we'll call language, and then we'll be able to start communicating and get civilization going. Ludicrous hypothesis, of course, because it begs all its own questions. But the point is that from their simian point of view, from their simian perspective, they would be thinking, oh, well, I would want a longer tail, maybe with a hand on the end of it, or stronger muscles here for ripping bark off trees better, or something better in the fingernail department. The set of interests and engagements that are determined by their form of life would dictate what they would consider to be an improvement, a development, an evolution. The point being that language did not evolve deliberately. There was never any Congress of apes who decided how they should evolve or how they might get a grip on possibilities that would lead to where we are today. Now, if we just change that mutatus mutandis to our situation, then all our ideas about how we might evolve, what the brave new future might be, what capacities we might develop, there are all so many contrived possibilities that are beholden to our interests, our form of life, our way of existing, while meanwhile the actual evolution is going on behind our backs, so to speak. So, what we're grasping for is new ways to think about thinking, if I can put it that way. New ways to think about transcendence, non-superstitious ways to think about transcendence and about thinking and about language. And what the apes actually did was not discuss and deliberately evolve, discuss their possibilities and decide which ones might be good things to develop. What they actually did was play. They played with their voices. They played with the sounds they can make. And in fact, I think there's some quite good evidence to argue that singing actually happened before what we think of as normal communicative language. All the most ancient languages are tonal. although the tonality has been lost, the formal tonality has been lost in most of them. But it was a question of play. So in that parallel, we might say, well, okay, here we are thinking, hang on, any contrived future that we think about is barking up the wrong tree. Maybe we have to stop trying and just do art. Art is the way we play with our capacities. And maybe in some sense, art can develop a way forward that science can't. Deleuze and Wittgenstein both show us new ways of thinking. New ways of thinking, not in the mode necessarily of trying to argue us into an epistemic belief, but rather by showing us through their style, through their ways of speaking, and in fact, by example, their ways of thinking, that try to capture and get around the problem I've just outlined. Now, this is perhaps time to mention in passing this an important distinction in philosophy. People will try and tell you that the big difference is analytic and continental. Seems to me that this is kind of otiose and really a fact of 20th century politics more than content of philosophy. What we do see in philosophy is a big divide between those who think philosophy is all about argumentation, all about providing arguments, and those who think philosophy is all about description, developing our powers of description to be able to describe new ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of living, not by arguing people into it, but more, you might say, leading by example, I suppose. More simply showing this is a possibility and you can study it and make what you might of it in your own life. So, big contrast there. That doesn't divide along national or political, let alone merely geographical lines. All right, so quickly, Deleuze. He publishes a series of monographs all through the 60s, short individual books on particular thinkers, I'm sure you know. Kant, Spinoza, Leibniz, Nietzsche, Bergson, Kafka. All lucid books, luminous books, books of profound insight, in my experience. And then comes a moment, and he writes a book called Identity and Difference, in which he doesn't discuss this or argue this or tell us even, but simply shows us that the old way of thinking, the way he's been thinking, that the history of philosophy is the story of a series of individuals, invariably men, who have put their stamp on their proprietary system, you might say, and the task of thinking today is to come along and, like a good consumer, shop around between the isms and the ologies and decide the one that you're going to buy, you're going to be. And by stopping writing those monographs and turning to write Identity and Difference, Deleuze is attempting to enact this epochal change where that old history of the individual is now over, and we're in a new world where we need to approach thinking in a new way. And the crucial thing about Identity and Difference for our purposes today is what Deleuze learns from Bergson and tells us he's learnt from Bergson. Actually, Bergson tells us that, at least in the beginning of the thought, he learnt it from Proust. And in Proust's monumental Remembrance of Things Past, in the very beginning volume, well, actually, let me go to the end first. It's a little bit like Tristram Shandy in that it's a piece of fiction that is reflexive. It revolves around someone writing the story that you are reading. But unlike the English ironists, Swift and Sterne, Proust's much more romantic writing doesn't approach this in any kind of flippant manner. He, in the last volume, gets to the point in the story where he starts to write the book that we've just reached the end of. And it happens when, as you probably know, he remembers something from that he chronicles right in the beginning of the first volume. Very early on in his childhood memories, he remembers, of course, eating the Madeleine cake, and the moment of profound experience that he has as a child at that moment. Now, when we get to the point where he starts writing the book at the end of the story, he has an experience where he says he remembers eating that Madeleine cake and realizes the following. And this is on the initial one you'll find on this Chatto and Windus edition. You'll find the initial experience on page 58 of volume 1. And the experience at the end is on page 231 of the last volume. And he says that memory is real without being actual, ideal without being abstract. Real, that moment back there in the past that he's just had this uncanny recollection of. He realizes it's not gone. Now, this is not the memory that he's been trying to manufacture mechanically by writing it all down. When he's doing it deliberately, when he's trying to remember his past and hang on to it and understand how we can somehow resurrect ourselves out of our own past, when he tries, it fails. But when he stops trying, a moment cuts through and he realizes that this moment is not gone. It's real without being actual. It's ideal without being abstract. Now, Deleuze reads this bit of Proust, and he's also kind of got a scientific background, Bergson, and he'd been studying and thinking about the science of optics, and especially about a very simple, very ancient observation, actually, certainly goes back to the birth of modern science. As we know, Newton began his scientific career by mucking around with a prism in a dark room. And the science of optics is as old as science itself. And it's always been realized that the thing about a mirror is when you look into it, there is an image. Now, we're trapped in metaphors here. Do we say there is an image in the mirror? There is an image behind the mirror? None of these really seem to describe it correctly. And so whoever it was, I don't know, came up with the term, it's virtual. The image is virtually there behind the mirror, and we see and experience that image while at the same time not forgetting that, of course, it's an illusion. The thing I'm looking at in the mirror is behind me, and it's just stating the obvious that every child knows. It's not really where it appears to be. It's an illusion. Now, notice something about this illusion. Like the rainbow, if scientists turn a spectroscope on the rainbow, they see a continuous gradation of wavelengths from the shortest violets to the longest reds. If you take a black and white photo of a rainbow, you just see a graduation of shades of grey. But when we look at the rainbow, of course, we see 7 bands of colour. And if we think about it, we understand, it's our categorization, our pigeonholes in our mind that we project upon the rainbow. The rainbow gets filtered through our categories, and we see 7 distinct colours with sharp bands between them. Now, we can understand this is an illusion, but it doesn't stop us seeing the rainbow as bands. It doesn't matter how well we understand, how sophisticated a scientist we are, the illusion remains, even if we understand it as an illusion. We see it actually as a necessary illusion. Bergson appropriates and develops, Deleuze appropriates and develops Bergson's theories as set out in Matter and Memory concerning the virtual. And it's very, very simple, very straightforward. Think of any object. Here I've got a Rubik's Cube in my hand. Although this is not Deleuze's terminology nor Bergson's, I think this is the simplest lens through which to view the point, and brings it out. Think of the difference, it might seem like splitting a hair, between whole and all. You know, when you look at the Rubik's Cube, you do not see all of the Rubik's Cube. You see this side with the orange squares facing you. You don't see any of these other sides. They're all mixed up. You do not see all the Rubik's Cube, but nevertheless, you see the Rubik's Cube as a whole. Here it is, the whole cube sitting in my hand. That's how you see it. Now, what Bergson and Deleuze, following him, say is that what we've got here, you've got your actual experience, but you've got, shall we call it a halo, of virtual experiences that you know you would have. And here we go, converting this actual into a virtual, this virtual into an actual. The virtual and the actual continually turn into each other. It's not a static situation where two static things are somehow brought together. It is a dynamic situation. Deleuze likes to call it a circuit of flow, which is in principle dynamic. It's a dynamic phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of flow, and the virtual and the actual convert back and forth into each other all the time. Now, what we've got to do carefully is to distinguish this from our old notion of possibilities, because the virtual is real. It's not mere possibilities, which for Deleuze crucially are not real. This way of thinking is profoundly opposed to the way of thinking. It goes all the way back to Leibniz, and it was solidified by David Lewis in his book Counterfactuals, and has entered into popular consciousness, that there is a plurality of possible worlds. And this could be real. We don't know. We call it now the multiverse. I guess I could add it to my fourth problem of, let me call them modern superstitions. We don't have the old superstitions anymore. We have these modern ones, but they're just as superstitious. And plurality of possible worlds, what David Lewis called modal realism, is simply a failure to understand Parmenides. Of course, all these possible worlds, how do we think of them? Well, they're all parts of a whole, aren't they? The whole shebang, the whole of all possible worlds. Now, again, come back to here when I said you saw the whole cube. I'm not pointing to an object and calling it the whole, as if there is a whole in reality. It is a mode of experience. It is a phenomenon. It is an appearance. The whole appears to you in this combination of actual and virtual. Actual and virtual together make the whole. So, possibility is not real. It's just a shadow. And Deleuze says this is a dimension of identity. It's how it's a sameness. Think of your shadow. You don't think of you and your shadow as two separate things somehow conjoined that could be separated. It's very much the way Hegel actually speaks of them as moments, and moments can be separated in abstraction, but in concrete reality, they're always found together. And even saying they're always found together makes it seem like an accident, an empirical matter of fact. It's not. It's a metaphysical necessity. For example, heads and tails on a coin. If I say, oh, that bag of coins there, just give me the heads. I don't want the tails. Well, you can't do that. You can only abstract heads and tails, separate them in abstraction. You can't actually do that in reality. They're moments of a single phenomenon. Consonants and verbs in language. Of course, we can distinguish them. We know the difference. But if I just say, oh, I'm not going to bother giving you the consonants, I'll just write down the verbs, string of nonsense. Likewise, just the consonants, no verbs, string of nonsense. To see language as a whole, the phenomenon, you have to see both moments and understand their inseparability, their actual concrete inseparability. So, this way of looking at experience brings in some very interesting ramifications. Straight away, okay, the usual assumption is that, well, the virtual world, it's a brand new thing. It's come along when they invented the computer, and it's a new challenge to humanity, and it's a complete novelty. Well, no, says Deleuze. It is the way perception has always worked. It is the way experience has always worked. What's happening with this new tool that we have in front of us and we're all using right now is that it is simply made the implicit structure explicit. Not fully explicit, there's still many questions, but it's brought out the implicit structure of our experience, of our existence, and presented it to us, sure, in a new way, and made it accessible in a new way, and in a way that is mind-bogglingly powerful, but it's still not something new. It's seeing what transcendence always was. Transcendence was the ability to see the whole. I'm going to switch over to Wittgenstein because I'm running out of time, and then come back to the problematic verses that I put between the two names. With the Tractatus, unfortunately, this is not really visible, but when I taught a Wittgenstein course a couple of years ago for the MSCP, I tried to summarised the Tractatus on one page, simply to convince the students of the first step, namely, everyone will tell you the Tractatus is the picture theory of language. But Wittgenstein himself tells us there's no theory. There's no theory there at all. I'm not making a theory. What I'm trying to do is paint a picture. It's not a picture theory of language. It's just a picture of language and how it connects with the world. A picture of what the language world whole is. And well, we don't have time to get into any detail or any depth on the Tractatus, other than to say that, yes, it's true, language makes pictures of the world because the world is made not of objects, but of facts. Facts, what is the case, have a logical structure, and we can mirror that in our language. That's what our language does, at least propositions that can be assessed as either true or false. And the whole network of propositions mirrors the world. That's the way we have a world. Now, just in passing with that comment about the picture theory of language, Wittgenstein, who he spent the First World War, at least second half of it, in an Italian prisoner of war camp, and was writing the Tractatus then. Not many people know, actually, he was also reading Nietzsche then. And one thing that Wittgenstein really profoundly resonated with in Nietzsche is the suspicion of the priestly caste, whether especially in philosophy or in thinking in general, human culture in general, the priestly ruse to set up a hierarchy of secondary and tertiary and so on individuals around the great sage with the illuminated insights, was a situation that he spent his whole life trying to avoid, and a highly problematic situation that actually he failed to avoid, because what we saw was a whole cult of Wittgenstein interpreters spring up, headquarters at Oxford University, who, at the risk of sounding arrogant, didn't get it at all. They only concentrated on what Wittgenstein was trying to say and ignored what he was trying to show. He already introduces this distinction in the Tractatus between saying and showing. It's Tractatus 4.022, where he says the true proposition shows itself when there's a harmony, a click between what a proposition says and what a proposition shows. And this distinction, this difference, stays with him. What he realizes in his later philosophy is that not that the Tractatus is completely wrong, holus bolus, throw it out and start again. No, but that this is a special case of a more general situation. Language does all sorts of different things and shows in all sorts of different ways. And this is what thinking is, getting the balance between saying and showing right. We see it all the time. How do we spot a liar? Well, we see that somehow they're showing that what they're saying is not true, whether it's through unconscious movements of small muscles in their face, or whether it's nervous demeanor, or whether it's a certain tone of voice, or other things to do with the whole context. We see what people show no less than we hear what they say. Now, to get to this problematic versus between Deleuze and Wittgenstein, those of you who know Deleuze know that he's quite anti-Wittgenstein, but it's all just passing comments that he makes. There's one in his book on Leibniz, The Fold, at the start of chapter 6, page 76, where he says, well, what the greatest book in 20th century philosophy is this one, Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. But then Wittgenstein's followers came along and muddied the waters, and everything got confused. He says in Logic of Sense, there's another one on page 145 to 46, where he mentions not only Wittgenstein's followers, but Wittgenstein and his followers. Now, the first one, I think, can be saved by this consideration of the priestly caste around Wittgenstein, who I agree muddied the waters completely. But then in Logic of Sense, he seems to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Wittgenstein out with the priests around him trying to explain him, who Wittgenstein, it must be pointed out, despised. What's going on here? To try and clarify, I want to mention something that Zizek says, actually. On YouTube, you'll find there's a little video of him talking about the virtual in Deleuze, and he says, logic, difference and repetition, absolutely brilliant. But he says, actually, the Nazis got everything except one thing wrong. The one thing they got right, and this is Zizek in deliberately provocative mode. Gotta love Zizek. The one thing they got right is burning books. But of course, they burnt the wrong ones. This publish and perish mentality has meant this tidal wave of literature, most of which is rubbish. And the two books of Deleuze that I would be the first to throw on the fire are Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. Now, definitely, beginning with Logic of Sense and into Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze has, let's say, flipped his wig and unloaded a kind of logorrhea. I was delighted when I heard Zizek say that, because I was never game to say what I thought myself, but it's exactly that. Now, this comes back to the attitude to Freud. Wittgenstein says, people say, oh, he's just ignorant of psychoanalysis and that whole dimension has passed him by, forget about Wittgenstein. Not at all. Wittgenstein also read Freud, and he said, look, Freud is like nuclear energy. Incredibly powerful, but also incredibly dangerous. If you imagine the government start encouraging nuclear energy, giving out rods of plutonium to anyone who wanted them, bringing them home, try and make a reactor in your backyard, solve the energy crisis. I only have to state it to say that would be a catastrophic, ridiculous thing to do. But here we are saying, oh, no, everyone should do a bit of armchair psychoanalysis and analyze their dreams. Wittgenstein wants to say, whoa, this is incredibly dangerous, incredibly powerful stuff, which ignores what I said in Culture and Value. In Culture and Value, it was a projected book, never published, and then the notes were found after he died and it was put into print. And there was a projected preface to that book, introduction. You'll find it on page 8 of Culture and Value. He says, after disparaging the priestly ruse, he says, it's a great mistake to think that the name of the game, the whole project, is to want to make everything explicit. From Hegel through to Freud, there's a profound stream in modernity where the project is to make everything explicit. And once everything has been made explicit, all will be revealed, enlightenment will have been achieved, and some kind of profound transcendence of our situation will occur. Wittgenstein, warning to the contrary. No, you have to understand the importance of the implicit. Now, I finally, thank goodness, reached what I want to leave you with, the takeaway point of this. It seems to me that Deleuze is rejecting Wittgenstein basically because he hasn't read him and hasn't understood him, and he's rejecting the cult of Wittgenstein priests who don't understand Wittgenstein. Because part of showing, of course, it's all about style. Your style of behavior, it's not an incidental thing. It is the virtual that interacts with the actual. And so Wittgenstein's aphoristic style, which in a way, like Nietzsche, tries to show the whole from a different perspective in each aphorism without submitting us to the misunderstanding, the delusion that there can be one grand system that shows it all, one huge edifice that will be the turning point in the history of philosophy. No turning point, rather back to work, says Wittgenstein, trying to sort out the misleading pictures that we have, not as a empirical, not an incidental thing, but because they're built into our grammar. Our grammar evolved in a world where it helped us survive and live and deal with that world. And as we get ourselves into new contexts, the grammar is no longer adequate. We're asking, what is time? And the grammar gives us these misleading metaphors. He says we're actually captives. We're trapped by it. We're imprisoned by our grammar. And the way out is to try and think about grammar. The pictures are time as a container or time as a stream. Both, he says, are misleading ways to think about time. And I want to add to that, as I indicated in my introduction, time as a dimension, also misleading metaphor. What we do know is that time dilation is a real effect, and relativity has actually confirmed that for us. So it's not the container that Isaac Newton thought it was. It is the relation that Leibniz thought it was. Well, again, return to a historical, or in this case, prehistorical observation. Old English, you might not realize, actually only has two tenses, past and present. And at some point along the way, the need was felt to capture this other grammatical tense that, the Roman invaders and various other languages that were being exposed seemed to be speaking about. And so English just reached for an auxiliary verb called will and bunged it on any other verb and turned it into what is called a future tense. I simply point that out to draw our attention to the fact that grammar has evolved. And here we are now in modern English, we have 12 tenses, past, future, present, and 4 versions of each of those. Simple, continuous, perfect, and perfect continuous versions of past, present, and future. 3 by 4 gives us 12 tenses. Now, I'm not going to tell you what linguistic innovations we need, what grammatical innovations we need in order to be able to start talking about time adequately. But I can tell you that we won't achieve it by any contrived means. We won't achieve it by thinking up a few new nouns or verbifying some adjectives, as we see all around us, in this contrived way to try and come up with a new way of thinking by finding a new way of speaking. We're not going to do it from the top down. It happens from the bottom up, if you like. The way the kids are speaking, the way children are speaking, percolates up and eventually comes through. So, I haven't done much justice to Deleuze, that's for sure, and scarce justice to Wittgenstein either. But I hope that I have been able to at least show you why I think time travel is not possible. People think it's possible but not actual. I think it's not even possible. That what intelligence is, totally unclear. That the simulation virtual world hypothesis it's not a possibility. These are pseudo questions that we are compelled by grammar to ask, but we need to try and stop asking and find new questions. And the reason I brought in the whole thought experiment of our simian ancestors is to try and tease out the thought that transcendence, it's temporary, it's not otherworldly, and it's everything to do with the virtual. This great extension of what the virtual is that in our lifetimes has exploded, I think is as significant in our history as, let's say, the invention of clothing. Clothing changed who and what we are by introducing a new kind of transcendence. Perhaps we can explore what I'm trying to mean by that in question time. But certainly a new kind of transcendence is blinking into being, is being created, not produced, created by our innovations with this machine. But all the anxieties and problems that we think surround it, they're all misguided and actually distract us from the higher potentials, such as the one we have achieved right now in the past hour. And I want to thank David for inviting me along to give another lecture, and to be grateful, very grateful to be part today of this virtual community. So that's my hour. I better draw a line there, and hand over back to David.
Well, thank you, Dr. David Rathbone, for addressing the Existentialist Society on visions of the virtual, Wittgenstein versus Deleuze. So before we